What's going on? Welcome to the episode. Today we're going to be talking about anxiousness, and more specifically, why is it that feelings of angst tend to ramp up the most on Sundays for a lot of folks? I have experienced a ton of this personally, and I've also seen it pop up in a number of my clients. And fortunately, there are some super concrete and clear patterns that I've noticed that I'm going to share with you, along with my personal experience and some actionable takeaway tips to wrap up. First of all, let's start by defining anxiousness. Anxiousness is described as experiencing worry, unease, or nervousness, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. For myself, I've experienced anxiousness prior to all sorts of things, like when I started my business, public speaking situations, certain travel experiences. We all know what feelings of angst are like. But why is it that we can also feel anxious when logically we know that there's actually no reason to be? For example, it could be a Sunday afternoon and you might feel angst for no apparent reason at all. You might even think to yourself, I have nothing to feel anxious about right now, and yet I feel incredibly uneasy. And unfortunately, it often feels like we can't even control these thoughts or feelings. Folks often refer to this as the Sunday Scaries, which you may have heard of, but I've got good news. You can control it. I've gained control over it personally with myself as well as with a number of my clients. So let's dig into exactly how. Let's address the most important question. Why Sunday of all the days? Why not Tuesday or Thursday? In order to establish some perspective here, let's take a slight step back and look at our week as a whole. Most folks work Monday through Friday and have Saturday and Sunday off, meaning most people have a fairly defined routine Monday through Friday and very little, if any, structure on the weekends. During the work week, you're most likely waking up and going to bed at roughly the same time, more or less. You're probably also eating roughly the same types of foods and at the same times. Typically, hopefully you're moving a fair bit, and most people tend not to drink all that much alcohol during the week. Weekends, on the other hand, usually look quite a bit different. Alcohol consumption tends to increase. Meals out and funky calorie-dense foods are often consumed in larger quantities. Our movement can often take a hit, and we tend to go to bed later. Now, hypothetically, if someone came to me and said, Marcus, I want to feel as anxious as possible, what should I do? The recipe that I would give them is essentially the typical weekend routine. Consume alcohol, the more the better, and mess with your sleep schedule. If you'd like to ramp things up even further, eat plenty of funky foods that throw off your digestion and make you feel like shit. And lastly, do not move much. Also, what often happens with this setup is folks feel quite anxious on a Sunday, maybe have another few drinks to take that edge off, and then they essentially delay those feelings of angst until Monday. So there's really no escaping this setup, meaning this whole Sunday Scaries / anxiousness piece is behavior and habit based, which is actually amazing news because, like I mentioned before, you have 100% control over your behavior and your habits. As an interesting side note, sleep deprivation is literally a torture technique in war. And why is it used? Because if I'm trying to get information from you, you are much more likely to give me that information when you are sleep deprived because your prefrontal cortex is impaired, which is key for rational decision making. Also, your pain tolerance lessens, so you're just more likely to quote unquote crack. There are all sorts of downstream disadvantages to sleep debt that essentially make you less resilient across the board. Now, this applies in your day-to-day life as well. Your ability to handle whatever life throws at you is impaired when you're lacking sleep. And when we compound that with alcohol from a neurochemical standpoint, being that booze impairs sleep quality like crazy, We've got the perfect recipe to feel anxious and unsettled, even if we logically know that we have no reason to be. Now, if we circle back to the definition of anxiousness, there's no imminent event, right? But the angst is still there due to how these habits and behavior impact your brain via alcohol and sleep. As many of you know, I used to be an alcoholic, and so I've got way too much experience with the post-booze blues and feelings of angst. I can't tell you how many times I've had that dark cloud of worry hanging over me on a weekend because I completely overdid it the night and or two prior. But the coolest part of this is that as my alcohol intake has come down, so has the anxiousness. And when I consume zero alcohol, I feel just as awesome on the weekend as I do during the week. Now, I still do sprinkle in a bigger night here and there. And over this past summer, I actually got to a point where I had one too many big nights. So I sat myself down, so to speak, and got really honest and objective about how I was feeling. In this situation, in order to put things into perspective for myself, I always ask myself this question: Marcus, what do you want most? If the answer is to crush drinks on the weekend, I have to be honest with myself about the trade-offs that I'm making from a physical, mental, and emotional health standpoint. But for myself at this point in my life, I'm just far more interested in waking up feeling great every day, or at least pretty close to it. And so I chose to reel things in booze-wise, and voila, I felt so much better. I'm sharing this information and personal experience with you because I want you to know that it's not like I've arrived and have the perfect lifestyle. I am still working on things like this on a daily and weekly basis. I continue to apply effort in all of these areas. I'm not perfect, and I don't want you to think that I'm just on point all of the time, because I am not. Life is always changing, priorities are shifting, circumstances move, and so this lifestyle stuff requires continuous work. It absolutely gets easier, but everyone, me included, is susceptible to slipping back into old habits if they're not paying attention. And again, I am no exception to that. The key is catching it sooner and sooner every time, which equates to it being easier and easier to get back to baseline. So now that we've established why a lot of us feel anxious on Sundays, what can we do about it? The body loves routine, and so the closer you can make your weekend routine to your weekday routine, the better. Now, you might be thinking, oh God, Marcus, that sounds so boring. Well, fair enough. It just comes down to where your priorities lie and what you want most. Potentially a little bit of boredom or a bunch of anxiousness. Now, there's absolutely a happy medium to strike here too, because you can always just reduce your alcohol intake and not go to bed quite as late on the weekends. It doesn't have to be identical to your weekday routine to reap benefits. It's just the closer you can get to that, the better that you're going to feel on a day-to-day basis. Also, it's going to be easier to predict how you're going to feel as well, because there are fewer moving variables when you keep your routine more consistent. For example, maybe you'd like to scale back from 8 to 10 drinks on the weekend to 4 to 6 and see how you feel. You don't have to completely cut out alcohol to lessen the feelings of angst. You might be able to just cut back a bit and find a sweet spot for yourself. The same thing applies to your sleep routine. Maybe hitting the hay at 1 a.m. has you susceptible to anxiousness, but heading to bed at midnight resolves it. Beautiful. The quote-unquote recipe is going to be different for everyone because everyone's priorities and life look different to one another. This is exactly why no two nutrition programs that I put together are exactly the same. Everybody has their own ideal. There's also a super important balance to strike in regards to social connection, because we're social animals and booze tends to be wrapped up quite tightly from a cultural standpoint with socializing. And so this is where things can get a little bit tricky. For example, I wouldn't recommend staying home every Friday and Saturday night because you don't want to drink. That is a net loss because you need to fill your social bucket as well. The happy medium is finding a way to scale back the booze at least a little bit while still getting your social fix. So here are a few tips that can help you do that. If you drink beer, go for lower percentage options because it'll reduce the total amount of alcohol that you consume without cutting back on the actual volume of liquid that you're drinking, so it really doesn't feel all that different. Also, this will reduce your calorie intake, which is a big plus if you've got body composition improvement goals. If you drink wine, go for a lower percentage alcohol option for the same reasons as the beer. If you prefer to go with spirits, order a single in a tall glass as it'll increase your fluid intake and hydrate you while simultaneously reducing your alcohol intake overall. Drinking a big glass of water between each drink actually works really well. It's just that most folks don't actually implement it. So what I'd recommend is always having a glass of water on hand along with your alcoholic bevy. This way, you can sort of go back and forth between the two. And if you're ordering multiple drinks, you've always got the water in front of you while you're waiting for your next beverage, which will make it more likely that you'll drink the water purely from a visual, it's in front of your face standpoint. Also, starting earlier and finishing earlier in regards to booze will lessen the negative impacts of alcohol and sleep impairment a lot. So if you have 4 drinks at happy hour from say 3 to 6 p.m. versus 4 drinks from 10 p.m. till 1 a.m., you're going to feel drastically better with the happy hour setup for 2 reasons. 1, your body is going to have more time to detoxify that alcohol before your head hits the pillow. And 2, you're going to get more better quality sleep, being that you go to bed earlier because syncing your sleep pattern up closer to the sunrise and sunset does seem to be more restorative even when you equate for total hours in bed. Having a big glass of water with a generous pinch of salt in it before you go to sleep can also help with hangover-like symptoms due to electrolyte balance. So that's a super quick and easy one to implement as well if you've had a few drinks. So if you're feeling anxious, the first 2 things to address are sleep and alcohol intake without a doubt. I'd also recommend dialing in your nutrition if it isn't already because it can only help directly and also indirectly via better sleep. Movement is another piece of this puzzle that is only going to better your sleep by expending energy / tiring you out and via getting light exposure, assuming you walk outdoors. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge that it can be really tough to reduce your alcohol intake. I know this firsthand because, like I mentioned before, it is so weaved into our culture. It's super prevalent to the point where if you say that you don't drink, you often get a surprised or even weird look from a lot of folks. And they'll often assume that you have a problem with substance abuse, which is unlike any other drug, which is saying a lot, again, because it signifies just how prevalent it is. No one gives you a surprised look if you choose not to partake in cocaine, for example. That is a perfectly socially acceptable skip, but alcohol is much more widely used and integrated into our culture. It's also such a massive part of how we socialize. So rewiring our association between alcohol and spending time with friends and family can be difficult, and it takes effort. It also requires you to be potentially uncomfortable because for a lot of people, alcohol takes the edge off in social situations. So if you cut the alcohol from the equation, all of a sudden, a bunch of folks are going to be forced to confront their insecurities in regards to socializing, and they need to push through that. So as I'm sure you can see, this can be a bit of a tricky topic, but I find the easiest and most practical place to start is by asking yourself a few straightforward questions. What are my priorities and/or what do I want most? Personally, I find boozing super fun, But for myself, it just got to the point where the funness of getting my buzz on wasn't outweighing the way that I felt in the subsequent days after I drank. So I still drink, but just not nearly as much as I used to. It's essentially like establishing a pros and cons list or a cost payoff situation. As soon as the payoff isn't worth the cost, we change our behavior because we only ever do things that we deem to be worth it in one way or another. And if you're asking yourself or wondering, why am I doing X thing that I'm telling myself that I don't quote unquote want to do? The reason is there are payoffs to that behavior that you're currently unaware of. Now, if you're curious as to how to go about finding out what those hidden payoffs are, you can start by writing that pros and cons list and adding and subtracting from it over the course of weeks as you identify more and more of the reasons while having those experiences. This does require getting really honest with yourself, and I'll warn you that you may not like what you see. I've had this experience so many times. For example, once I found out that the booze was at the root of the anxious feelings I was experiencing, I had to accept the fact that if I chose to drink too much and mess with my sleep moving forward, that I was actually choosing to feel anxious because I now know that 1 + 1 = 2, right? Now, the cool thing about this is that it's extremely empowering on the other end of things because before I connected the dots, I believed that the angst was just random and out of my control. That turned out not to be true at all. It's now a choice for me, and there's no good or bad here. It just comes down to priorities at the end of the day. So overall, this should be super empowering information, and even if you choose not to change a thing around any of this stuff, there's no need to judge yourself or anything like that. Just accept what you're choosing and that it's working for you on some level or another, at least for right now, because the truth is we're all doing the best that we can. If you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness, on TikTok at the N1Fitness, and feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. YouTube, I'm also at Marcus Sadu. And lastly, be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're using. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope that you found this useful. And if you have any questions at all about how to implement this into your lifestyle or concepts like it, do not hesitate to reach out. I will catch you on the next episode. See you later.